All right, so here's a deja vu moment for you. Adler's birth order theory. Remember Adler? Hey, remember all the way back to the psychodynamic approach, Alfred Adler. And look at, he actually has a contribution here and an interesting one to the biological approach. So there's not really clear boundaries, as far as our compartments between these different areas of research, although they usually have a prominence in their focus, and Adler's prominent focus was psychodynamics. However, he was really interested in birth order, and he was one of the first people to come up with a theory for which there is some correlational evidence. Okay, so a lot of people have been coming up with theories and still are, but the first one who came up with one for which there's some correlational evidence. And so you notice now on this slide that he's got 5 different categories: oldest, second child, middle child, youngest, and the only child. So 5 different categories here. So how many children must there be in a family? What's the minimum number for there to be a middle child? Okay, and if you thought 3, you're wrong, right? Because look at that more closely. If there's 3, what is that second child called in Adler's theory? They're called the second child. So there's at least 4 children if there's a true middle child, 1 or more. There's got to be, with 4 there's 1, and with over 4 there could be more. So you might want to take that into account when you are trying to figure out which of these you are. So we all should now have a clear picture which category we belong. Let's take a look at this really interesting theory. We're going to start with the oldest child. Okay. Adler said the really interesting thing about the oldest child is that they are always dethroned. Okay. So what oldest means, tell me what, that there's a family of at least 2, right? Because otherwise that person is going to be categorized in, according to Adler's theory, as an only child. So with his definition of oldest child, they are always, always dethroned. Okay, so this is somebody who always has to go through the dethroning by the next child. They're on the throne, but only for a limited amount of time until that next child comes along. Then they have to learn to share. So they usually learn that pretty well, learning how to share. But parents' expectations, he said, are unusually high. Okay, and again, we've got some correlational evidence for this, that usually parents' expectations are unusually high for the first child when they're the oldest, when there are younger ones under them. They're often given more responsibility than the other child or children, and expected to set an example. If you're an oldest child, you're going, yeah, I know what that's about, right? And they may become authoritarian. They may become kind of bossy. But that also can be directed more positively in a way where they might instead of being kind of strict and authoritarian, be more nurturing. Okay? They have a tendency to feel that power is their right. Okay? Let's see now. Now we're going to go to the second child. Okay. Second child. Adler said that a really important thing, interesting thing about a true second child is that he has a pacemaker. So he or she always has somebody setting the pace. And of course, that's the oldest child, right? So second children tend to be, there's a larger chance that they are more competitive. So they tend to be a little more competitive than other born children, okay? They have a tendency to want to overtake the older child. They may become a rebel and trying to outdo everybody. And sometimes, competition can be a really good thing, right? It can really be driving and can help lead somebody to success. But sometimes that, needs to be managed carefully by parents, or otherwise that can turn into rivalry, okay? Sibling rivalry. Now we've got the middle child, and Adler said, the interesting thing about the middle child is that they are sandwiched in. They're sandwiched in, and they're more likely than other kids to feel that they're kind of squeezed out of a position of privilege and attention and significance. Okay? They tend to be more even-tempered than other children, and have more of a take it or leave it attitude, not as likely to be sucked into competition. Oftentimes, I always thought this was interesting, but middle children, there's a higher prevalence of them becoming fighters of injustice in the future. So some kind of a career where they're fighting injustice, and very interesting. They also can have a higher than normal need for attention, as you can imagine, feeling like they're not in the spotlight through the time that they're growing up. On the other hand, sometimes that can be a positive thing. I remember as a middle child, I was a true middle child. And what happened in my family was that by the time the first two, my parents had been working with the first two and I came along, they were just too tired to do that gender social role with me, or be too strict with me. And, I was out in the back fields creating underground camps and up in the trees and building tree houses just as much as I was playing with dogs or playing veterinarian or whatever, right? But I'm going to tell you one middle child story because it really captures what Adler is saying about middle children sometimes feeling like they're not getting the attention that they deserve. And when I was really tiny, I was like 3 years old. I don't even remember what I was upset about, but I was really upset about something. And I decided I was going to run away from home, okay? And you have to understand that, I was allowed to ride my bike a certain distance, which was 2 houses in either direction at that time down the street. So we didn't live on a street with traffic. And when there's very little traffic, and when there was, we knew everybody and they were very careful. And even at 3 years old, I could ride my bike 2 houses down either way because we knew those people, right? And that was the limit, though, if I was by myself. That was it. And so I got on my bike, and the furthest I had ever been with other people, with my parents on a bike, have been a block away because we would do the circle thing. And I went like a block and a half away. And so, believe me, I'm 3 years old. This is a foreign country, right? I am a long way away from home, and I am in a foreign country. And, I don't recognize anything. I don't know anybody. I'm in no man's land. And what do you do then? And I remember, pulling my bike up to the curb and sitting down on the curb and sitting there and sitting there and sitting there. Hey. And it probably was maybe 10 minutes. It felt like 10 hours to me. I was convinced I was probably gone for 10 hours. But, what finally happened is I started thinking about food, and I started getting hungry. And I started to think, oh, maybe home wasn't such a lousy place after all. Maybe I, give it one more shot. And so I got on my bike, and I'm riding back, and I'm thinking, this is going to be this big scene, right? They're all going to be in tears and hugging me, and nobody even noticed that I was gone. Oh, that's a classic Elderian middle child story, right? All right. So moving on, youngest child. in Adler's theory. Adler said the interesting thing is they always have many mothers and fathers. So they can have a number of mothers and fathers because that's what the older kids play with them, mother and father. That's how they are treated as children of the older kids. The older kids treat them that way. The older kids try to educate them. That can really be an advantage, right? The youngest child is never dethroned, okay? So it can take some effort on the part of the parents to teach sharing to a younger child. And if they don't, that child might end up being spoiled and not knowing how to share in life, okay? They tend to want to be bigger than others. So there's a tendency there to want to grow up and be bigger than others with younger children. And really interesting when we look at their occupational life later on down the road is the only thing that Adler found that was a significant correlation component here, correlation coefficient here that was sufficiently larger than with the other children, is that they have a tendency sometimes to make huge plans that never work out, youngest children. Okay, then we've got the only child. And what Adler thought was the most interesting thing with the only child is that this birth is always viewed by the parents as a miracle. Okay, and that really plays in this child's experience. Not always good because the parents have had no previous experience in parenting, right? However, they certainly don't lack attention. So the joke here is that they retain 200% attention from both parents. Okay? They may become the rival of one parent, even for the other's attention. They can be sometimes overprotected and spoiled. But they like being the center of adult attention. Even as children, they are more comfortable oftentimes around adults than with their own peers. And in fact, the parents tend to treat them like little adults. And so they oftentimes have difficulty speaking, you might say, the same language, as their peers. They talk more like adults and prefer adult company over that of their own peers oftentimes. Now, I told you that Adler's was the first birth order theory to get correlational coefficients of significance. But remember that they can be weak and still be significant correlation coefficients. And I want to tell you this, Adler's birth order theory is no longer the most prominent one. And it's very interesting, and there's interesting facets of it, okay? But the correlations are modest. So there are significant correlational coefficients, but they are modest with that theory. And one in which they are much stronger, that is becoming pretty popular now, is Sullivan's birth order theory. Okay, and so this Sullivan's is really interesting. Take a look at the slide. Okay, his is based more on the Big Five personality traits, and the types of predictions that we see are really, I think, more interesting than Adler's. Okay, so first off, we've got really good correlational evidence that firstborns tend to be higher in conscientiousness than laterborns. Okay, and of course that's not 100% of firstborns and 100% of laterborns being lower, but overall that's pretty strong. And firstborns also tend to be lower on agreeableness and open-mindedness than laterborns. Okay. They tend to be more conventional. They tend to be more achievement-oriented. Okay. And they have a higher need for approval from others. So some positive things, some negative things. It's always a mixed bag. okay, with Soloway. And then later borns tend to be, instead of more conventional, they tend to be more liberal. Remember that fighters of injustice thing? You see some things jive right up with Adler's theory here, just like the achievement-oriented with the firstborns. Laterborns tend to be more rebellious, and that's probably why there's less of a need for approval, is that they tend to be more rebellious, where firstborns are more of a drive to please the parents. And then laterborns are also tend to be more open-mindedness. So rebelliousness might get them into trouble, okay, but open-mindedness is a pretty good thing. Another mixed bag there, but this is a pretty positive characteristic where laterborns tend to be more independent thinkers. Now, the most interesting thing of all about Soloway's birth order theory is one that isn't even on this slide, okay? And that is how he talks about, if you go and read further about this theory, go into PsycInfo, that's the main literature, you know, for psychology and library database on the computer, PsycInfo, and then you search for Soloway and birth order. So you just combine those two phrases, and you'll get to read a lot more about a really interesting birth order theory. And what I find fascinating is that each later born child in a family, so if there's more than one kid, they tend to find their niche. And so they tend to find a way that they excel and are different than the other siblings. So that really can affect your personality, right? So that somebody, you already have a sibling that's a certain way, you're more likely to be different, to pick a different niche where you can stand out. I think that is so cool. You're going to be seeing these pictures later, but to demonstrate something else, but let me show you something here. Or you already saw them in the trait approach. Okay, so remember this picture. Let me see if I can get it centered for you. Okay, these are my nieces. And take a look at the next born and how very different we are. Remember that? All right, so that's Soloway's birth order theory. Very strong correlation coefficients, very respectable. And it'll be interesting to see. He's still developing his theory. He's still writing. He has a lot of writings, a lot of studies on it. You might want to follow his work, and who knows, some of you might want to go on to graduate school and study under him. Who knows where this personality class could lead. Okay. Now, I promised you that I was going to tell you some more really cool physiological research for personality. And that's where we're going to start in our next segment.